Okay, so when we last left Chuck, he'd come up with this basic idea of natural selection. And again, he writes down a couple of drafts, laying it out in 1841 and 1844. He knew, by the way, that the idea was a bit of a live wire, and that if he just rushed into print with it, he'd be not even, I mean, he'd get some religious pushback, but mostly he'd get criticism that he was being too speculative. I mean, sounds like a great idea, but does it really work in the real world where the rubber meets the road? So he spent much of, after about 1840, he spent almost 20 years after that working on various projects, but also gathering more data. There were some experiments he could do himself. He raised pigeons at that country house that you saw and experimented in breeding them. He tried breeding plants and would end up doing various research projects on plants in his greenhouse. And he wrote letters to everybody. I think I mentioned that they're up to, I think, 24 volumes of Darwin's collected letters, and they aren't finished yet. Believe it or not, the post office of the day was so fast and so efficient that you could write a letter to somebody in the morning and get a response back by evening. I mean, it helps that Great Britain isn't hugely large, but you know, it wasn't that much slower than email. So you could really carry on conversations that way. And he found that evolution by natural selection seemed to explain a lot of biological facts, most of which Darwin himself didn't discover, but he realized that they made sense in the light of evolution. So as he wrote in the introduction to the book that laid it all out, a naturalist reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, on their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and other such facts, might come to the conclusion that each species had not been individually created, but had descended like varieties from other species. So what's he mean? Well, here's one example. This was not something Darwin discovered. It had been, I think the first time anybody really noticed was back in the 1500s. It's a field called comparative anatomy. You look at the anatomy of lots of different species and look for similarities and differences. The real George Cuvier, the guy who worked out extinction, who you saw in the video yesterday, was a pioneer of comparative anatomy. So was one of Darwin's associates, this weirdo by the name of Richard Owen. And they noticed things like this. There's a bat wing on the left, a seal flipper on the right, a human hand in the center. They do radically different things. The bat wing is for flying. The seal flipper is for swimming. Human hands are for playing the piano or, you know, making pottery or all of the many thousands of things that humans do with our hands. They're very different in function, and yet you can match them up with each other bone for bone. The human hand, for example, you'll notice that your thumb has one fewer joint than the rest of your fingers. Notice it's the same on the seal flipper. If you look at that seal flipper, that digit on the left-hand side has one fewer joint in it. Even though when the seal's actually swimming, those fingers are all bound together by skin and muscle to make the flipper. Why do you have that similarity in structures that are otherwise so functionally different? Why does every other finger consist of 3 phalanges, right? That's the movable joints on your finger. And the largest phalanx connects to a carpal. That's in humans, that's these bones right here. Actually, that's the metacarpals right there. And the metacarpals form joints with the 10 carpals right here. Why do you have the same pattern in the flipper? It's not as easy to see at this magnification, but you've got the same pattern in the back wing. Why do you have that similarity of structure in the face of such radically different function? Darwin's associates, never really good friends, kind of a super nerd by the name of Richard Owen, had actually noticed this before, and he'd already written that all vertebrates were variations on one common plan, which he called the archetype, because they all had the same basic structural plan. It might be modified quite a lot for different functions, but it was still one basic structure. And the word that Owen coined for this kind of similarity is one that you may have heard before. It's called homology. But Owen didn't really bother coming up with an explanation for why it works. And so Darwin asks, why does it work? Why do we get homology? Oh, Owen, by the way, was the curator of a major collection of human anatomical specimens and also of animal anatomical specimens. He had a huge collection of bones and pickled organs and pickled limbs and things like that. And it was used for medical education. Then as now, medical students would study not just dissect cadavers, but they'd study preserved organs and preserved skeletons and things like that. And Owen worked out a deal where if any animal died in the London Zoo, he got first dibs on dissecting it and preserving the skeleton or whatever parts he wanted to preserve. Now, one of the ways you can extract a skeleton, although it's actually not the best, is by boiling it until the flesh and the organs become so soft that they just fall right off. Which explains why Owen's wife must be one of the most patient women in all of history, because she woke up one morning to find out that her husband was down in the basement boiling a rhino, boiling a dead rhino. And I have never done this myself, but apparently boiled rhino smells really, really bad. So like if you're ever at a restaurant and the rhino soup is on the menu, you'll probably just want to go with the chicken fingers. Okay, play it safe. If you're ever at a churrascaria and they come around with a big skewer of rhino, you're probably going to want to wait for the steak. I'm just saying here. So that was the kind of person that Richard Owen was, a guy who boiled dead rhinos in the basement. And also so vain that he would only pose for a portrait wearing his academic robes. He's wearing the British equivalent of cap and gown in that picture. And yeah, not a very easy person, frankly, kind of a prick. But he coined this idea of homology, but he never came up with an explanation for why it's there. Darwin says, well, maybe it's there because if you go back far enough in time, bats, people, seals, and a lot of other species too, descend from a common ancestor, and they've all inherited this pattern of building a hand, but each one has modified it for different uses, for flight, for swimming, for running, if you're a cat, for prey capture, if you're a cat, for writing novels, if you're a person, all of these things, they have similar structures because the organisms that have them inherited that basic plan from a common ancestor. Okay, maybe so. Here's another one, what we call vestigial structures. Most mammals can wiggle their ears. You know, you may have seen cats moving their ears around to pick up sound, or sometimes to signal their emotion. Like a cat that lays its ears back is probably about to seriously rip you, right? You've seen that? Okay, I had a cat that was very fond of doing that. Whenever I offended this cat by, basically by existing, she'd get really upset about that. She'd come over and try to shred me. You've seen dogs prick up their ears. You may have seen cows or horses flick their ears to get rid of flies, but also it helps them focus on the source of the sound if you swivel your ears around. And as far as I know, all mammals have muscles that move their external ears. You have muscles that move your external ears too. They're the 3 auricularis muscles right there. Most people never learn how to use them. A few people can. When I mentioned this in a typical class of Biology 1400, there's usually going to be at least a couple of students out of a classroom of maybe 70 who are able to wiggle their ears without moving another muscle in their face. But most of us never learn how to do that. I certainly can't. I'm guessing very few of you can. Can anybody wiggle your ears without moving anything else? Okay, maybe a little bit. Okay, all right, well, good for you. You have a skill that I don't have, I respect that. But here's the thing, ear wiggling doesn't make any difference to survival and reproduction. I have asked, I've never found somebody who told me, you know, hey, I was in danger and I wouldn't have survived, except at the right moment I was able to wiggle my ears. I've never met anybody who said, you know, a very attractive person of the extremely opposite sex told me, hey, I really, really love you and I want to have lots of babies with you because you can wiggle your ears. Now, it would not surprise me if there were such people out there. Hell, there's probably a webpage for ear wiggling fetishists or something like that, because there is for everything else. But in the vast majority of cases, your ability to wiggle your ears makes no difference to your ability to survive and to reproduce. You could probably have those muscles surgically removed and never notice they were gone, probably. There are actually other muscles in, there's one in particular in the lower leg that can be surgically removed and used to repair muscles and tendons from other parts of the body. And assuming the surgery goes well, you never know it's missing. What are these parts doing there? Why should we have them? Why do we have ear wiggling muscles that most of us will never use? And that even if we could use, would do us no good other than maybe entertaining people at parties. Darwin would have said, well, we inherited these from an ancestor that did wiggle its ears and need to wiggle its ears, maybe to focus on the direction of sound better. And we still have inherited them from that distant ancestor, even though we no longer have a use for them. Kind of like the really ugly lamp that we have in my mother's house that she inherited from her mother, who got it from her mother. And we don't really know what it's doing there, and it just really looks kind of yucky, but we've still got it, we just haven't gotten rid of it yet. Maybe our auricularis muscles are the same kind of thing. There's an entire subfield of biology called biogeography that deals with the study of animal and plant distribution. Why do we find them where we do? And we've already talked about this in the context of the Galapagos. Why do the Galapagos have so many species that are unique to them, and yet at the same time, they're similar but not identical to ones that you could find in the South American mainland? Why do we have this similarity and yet not identity? Why do we have a hawk that's almost like the North American red-tailed hawk, but isn't? You know, for that matter, why do we have finches with great big beaks that crack seeds like a parrot, but we don't have any parrots? And here's another one, the study of embryos. And this is another thing that Darwin did not work on himself. This had already been pointed out. There was a German guy named Karl von Baer and a Swiss gent named Louis Agassiz, who had already pointed out that if you looked at a lot of embryos from different species, the adults might look completely different, but the embryos might be very similar. So if you open a chicken egg, I think that's roughly 72 hours after fertilization, and a turtle egg at a similar stage, you can hardly tell those things apart. Now, as development goes on, the turtle begins developing what will become the shell, and the chicken doesn't, so you can come to tell them apart, but early embryos look really similar. You did not look radically different from that turtle or chicken embryo at a very early stage of your own development. You know, somewhere in my lab, I've got a chick embryo and a pig embryo. And again, they don't look, they both will have that strongly flexed shape with the paddle-like appendages and these clefts in the neck region called the pharyngeal slits. Why should those similarities exist in the first place? Why do turtles and chickens, so otherwise different, go through a stage when they're in the egg when you can hardly tell them apart? Why is there that similarity, you know, even at a stage where long before they can survive on their own? Why should it be there? And then there's fossils. Darwin had already noted that there were fossils that tended to blend characters of what we now consider very separate groups. Now, soon after the Origin of Species came out, came the discovery of a critter called Archaeopteryx, and you saw that in the video yesterday. There's actually a replica Archaeopteryx on display in this building in that display case outside room 102. If you know where that is, there's that kind of lounge area where there's a snacks machine and tables. Opens into that courtyard that they're turning into some kind of sustainable agriculture project. You know where I'm talking about? Yeah, there is a display case nearby that's got a Archaeopteryx replica if you want to see what it looks like for yourself. And then there's that relationship that Darwin had noted in Brazil and Argentina, where he collected fossils that bore this odd resemblance to unique South American living species. Fossil armadillos that looked a heck of a lot like living armadillos. Fossil sloths that looked a heck of a lot like living sloths. There's probably fossil capybaras out there, although I don't actually know the details on that. Why is there that similarity in one place between the dead and the living? The dominant philosophy of science at the time was that you ought to stick to the facts and be very, very careful about coming up with speculative hypotheses. So Darwin wasn't really willing to go public right away because it would have been a risk to his reputation. He was not, again, a person who made brilliant logical leaps. He was a plotter, a very intelligent man, but not the sort of person who was really quick to come up with these incredible conclusions. He was a lot more patient than that, a lot better at slowly grinding out ideas from huge amounts of data. And there was a bit more conservative religious and political climate at the time, which meant that Darwin would have been risking quite a lot if he went public with this too soon. Oh, by the way, that's Darwin with his oldest son. If you're wondering why the son appears to be wearing a dress, the answer is that up until about 100 years ago, it was actually standard to put kids of both sexes in dresses. Boys would wear dresses until typically somewhere between the ages of 2 and 6. Partly because it's a lot easier to clean them up when they still haven't got this whole toilet training business down. It's a lot easier to clean up someone in a dress than somebody in pants. So yeah, that was the way they raised kids back then. Anyhow, a book came out in 1844 that did present some evolutionary ideas, mostly kind of a retread of Lamarck. And it came out anonymously, and it ignited a small firestorm. It was called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Nobody knew who wrote it, and everybody was scandalized by it. You know, this is the Victorian age, so you read it and you go, "Oh, my delicate sensibilities, I fear I may faint." Oh. Right, anyway. That caused a scandal, and one thing Darwin was not was hungry for scandal. Right? Darwin never had an Instagram feed. He never tried to gain followers on Twitter. You know, he was never the subject of a reality show. Nobody would have greenlit a series called Keeping Up with the Darwins because he was boring and liked it that way and didn't want to cause some kind of horrified reaction. The author, by the way, was a Scottish publisher named Robert Chambers. And he kind of rushed into print and made this sweeping argument for evolution, but didn't really impress the scientists. Darwin wanted to do better than that. So he spent over 20 years fact gathering and working on other projects at the same time. And he wrote these 2 manuscripts in 1842 and 44, but they weren't published during his lifetime. He thought he might die young because he was in such bad health. So he actually left the 1844 manuscript in an envelope with a letter to his wife saying, "If I'm dead, take this and try to get it in print. Talk to our friend, Mr. Lyle. Here's some money. I want to get some kind of credit for this idea that I've had. And if it turns out to be successful, you know, I want my name on it." You know, he spent all this time coming up with this, you know, you do want some sort of recognition for it. As it turned out, he lived to be over 70, and the drafts weren't published in his lifetime. And then, as he's puttering away on this in 1858, working on a giant book that would have explained all of this in full detail, he got a letter from a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who you saw in the video yesterday. He's the guy who is in Malaysia. Wallace did not come from a wealthy background, and he was making his living as a professional collector. Museums and rich people with a hobby of collecting would pay him to go to exotic parts of the world and collect exotic animals, plants, seashells, beetles. His first trip, by the way, was actually a collecting trip to Brazil. And as he was sailing home with this cargo of exotic animals and rare plants and rare minerals and all of the beautiful things of Brazil, the ship caught fire and he lost everything but one parrot. So he might have had the idea sooner if he hadn't had to deal with that. But he was in Malaysia collecting beetles, as you saw, and he was actually recovering from a bout of malaria when he had this idea. And he basically hit on the idea of natural selection completely independently and wrote this letter to Darwin, and Darwin was absolutely devastated. Darwin said, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript written in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. Okay, Darwin. So Darwin and his friends agreed to compromise with Wallace. Some extracts from Wallace's letter and some writings of Darwin's writings were cut and pasted together and presented in a jointly written paper in 1858. That's the first public announcement of natural selection. Darwin then takes the huge book that he's writing and cuts it down to a more manageable length, only 400 pages, and publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in December 1859. The book sells out on the first day, becomes a bestseller. You may not believe this when you're reading it because it does tend to drag, but it was very widely read. And I should mention, I've got a whole book claiming that Wallace basically got cheated out of his proper credit. Wallace himself was okay with the way things turned out. And Darwin had been working on this since 1837. Only a small circle of his friends knew what he'd been up to. He hadn't gone public with it. There was a limited number of people that he was kind of fighting this idea into. One of them was Lyell. But he did want to get credit for this thing he'd been spending 20 years thinking about, right? If you had an idea that you'd been developing and nursing and working on and questioning and testing and trying to support for 20 years, and some hotshot comes with the same idea, you're probably not really willing to say, oh, you go ahead. You know, if you think it's a good idea, you know, it's not a bad thing to want some credit for it. And his friends knew it, and Wallace was okay with the way things turned out. I don't really think Darwin can be said of stifling Wallace because they did publish their ideas together. So if we're handing out shares of credit, we'll give some to Wallace. And Wallace would end up making some very important contributions in his own right, and I'll talk about those towards the end. We haven't seen the last of Mr. Wallace. So The Origin of Species comes out, boom. Public reaction was rather strong. Darwin actually says nothing about human evolution On the Origin of Species. And I should mention something, and I'll head it off right here. If you read the full title, the title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, years ago, back when I thought it was not a waste of time, I actually debated somebody over evolution at a magnificent place called Heritage Baptist Temple in South Little Rock. You're nodding. Have you been there?
Oh, no, I did something a wonderful place.
Well, their gym is pretty nice. That's where we had the debate. And yeah, my pickup truck got keyed, so yeah, well, I mean, you know, I had about 10 students had come out to see me, and the church was bussing in people from, you know, you drive into the parking lot, there's about 10 church buses lined up there, and you pretty much know how this is going to be. Anybody ever seen the Harlem Globetrotters? They're a basketball team, but they specialize in tricks, you know, so they do crazy shots and they do comedy things and they do these acrobatics, and you know, they'll shoot the free throw with a ball on a rubber band so it comes boinging back. And they bring a team with them called the Washington Generals. And the Washington Generals play a legal game of basketball, but that's not what anybody comes to see. What everybody comes to see is the comedy. The comedy would not work in a real basketball game. I mean, there's a reason why you don't see LeBron James taking trick shots while spinning a basketball on his finger, right? And the reason is that that does not work in the actual NBA. But that's what people come to see. So I was basically the Washington Generals, trying to play a legal game of basketball against, an audience that's basically there just to watch me get beaten up. And the guy pointed out that, on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races, there are some races that are favored. Clearly, Darwin was a racist and the father of the Holocaust. And the guy showed a bunch of concentration camp photos. What's that?
How lovely.
Yes, charming man. I pointed out that it was great that he'd read the title page of the book, but if you read the actual freaking text, he doesn't mention human evolution at all. You can look, the whole thing's online and you can do a search of the whole text if you doubt my word on this. There's a place where he mentioned races of cabbage, another one where he mentions races of dogs. And it's clear that race in this case just means variety. And that's the way the word was used in Darwin's time. It doesn't specifically mean human races at all. The big sandwich tomatoes and salad tomatoes and cherry tomatoes at the supermarket would be called different races back then. And it's got nothing to do with people. Except until 1965, you couldn't water them from the same fountains. Oh, yuck. Did I just say that? I'm kidding. That's terrible. Bad professor. Anyway, so he doesn't get into humans at all. There's like a throwaway sentence at the end. It's something like, when these views are fully adopted, light will be thrown on the origin of man and of his history. And that's about all there is. But it did not take people very long to realize that if evolution by natural selection is true, it applies to us. And that's got some very unflattering implications. So that's a cartoon from 1861, where a gorilla is asking the very uncomfortable question, am I a man and a brother? Now, since I brought up racism, let me go ahead and address this. The point of the joke is it's actually a parody of something that Darwin's family was associated with. Darwin's family had always been very outspoken in their opposition to slavery. There was no slavery in Great Britain itself. There had been some court cases that had decided that back in the 1700s. The UK would never have slaves. It was still going on in the colonies. Of course, it went on in the American colonies and then continued after we became the independent United States. You know that story. And it had still been going on in British colonies like Suriname and Jamaica. It had finally been banned throughout the British Empire in, I want to say 1833, 34, it was early 1830s. But the Darwin family had always been strongly opposed to it and publicly supported campaigns to end it. And Darwin hated slavery, and I mentioned he'd seen it in Brazil. They visited a plantation and, seen how the slaves were treated. And I mentioned that incident where a plantation owner called in all of his slaves and said, "How do you like this?" And they all said, "We love being slaves." And Darwin said, "Dude, they're not telling the truth because the owner's right freaking there." So there's an actual quote. "These deeds are done by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves. It makes one blood boil, yet heart tremble to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty." Have been and are so guilty. It's critical race theory. Yeah, well, I've been teaching evolution in Arkansas for over 20 years, but this isn't enough. So let me give you some critical race theory here. really upset everybody. Darwin's grandfather and the guy who made the family rich was a man named Josiah Wedgwood. I'm guessing that most of you, being poor college students, are not really into collecting very expensive china, right? I mean, maybe you are, who knows? But I will just say that Wedgwood china has been around for a very long time, and some of it is very collectible and very expensive. And Wedgwood had founded the company, and Wedgwood had a pretty good scientific background, and he used his scientific knowledge to develop new mixes of clay, new colors, new glazes, and came up, got wealthy, mass producing some very attractive products. And the factory lasted, I think they're still going. I think you can still get Wedgwood china if you want. And he was Darwin's grandfather, and he made a huge amount of money. That was why Darwin's family was so well off, because Darwin's father had married a Wedgwood, Darwin's mom. And he created these medallions that he sold. This was a meme back then. There were memes before the internet. You can see it's a chained slave kneeling and the caption is, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Wedgwood sold these things to raise awareness of the anti-slavery campaign and to raise funds for it. And now Wedgwood's grandson, Darwin, is raising the very uncomfortable possibility that, holy cow, not just Africans, but gorillas might be brothers or at least close relatives of proper English folk. Oh dear, I may faint. Horrible. Ah. And things really did heat up when he went on to publish his views on human evolution in a couple of books, The Descent of Man in 1871, and The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals in 1872. There's Darwin as a monkey holding up a mirror to test the monkey's emotional reactions. This was the kind of experiment that he did. The Descent of Man laid out everything that was known at the time of the evidence that humans had evolved. Most of the famous fossil discoveries had not been made, but what there was, he reviewed. He argued, for example, that humanity had arisen in Africa because our closest relatives are gorillas and chimps, and they are native to Africa. And then the expression of the emotions in man and animals argues that there is not an unbridgeable mental gap between us and other animals, that we may be smarter and we may have very deep emotions. And it was often felt that humanity was special because we have such fine feelings. But non-human animals have feelings too. They have emotions, they can express them. Just as our hands are homologous to animal parts, our happiness, our sorrow, our grief, our anger, our spite have homologs in the minds and in the behaviors of non-human animals as well. Humanity's not nearly as special as we like to think we are. And that really bothered people. Descended from apes, my dear, let us hope it is not true. But if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known. That's supposedly a genuine quote, although nobody can tell exactly who said it, and its authenticity has perhaps been questioned. But there were certainly people that felt that way. As I mentioned, Darwins today sometimes get attacked for being a racist. That's Glenn Beck. About 12 years ago, I actually listened to the entire radio show, and transcribe the quote directly so that you wouldn't have to. Where he goes up and says, Charles Darwin is the father of modern day racism. This guy is a horrible racist. Charles Darwin is the father of the Holocaust. And as I mentioned, I got hit with that argument when I was debating at Heritage Baptist Temple. Wazi. Okay, by 21st century standards, there's no question that Darwin was. I mean, Darwin was wealthy and he was British at a time when Britain is building up one of the largest empires in history. 1847 is when the British begin to rule India directly. They've got their colonies in South Africa. They've got, I don't know about South America, but there's Belize, started out as a British colony, British Honduras, Jamaica, Canada does not become independent until 1869, and even then it's still partially ruled by Britain. I don't think they got complete independence until the 1930s. You know, the sun never sets on the British Empire. They're big, they're rich, they're making lots of money. Darwin's a part of it. Clearly, he would have considered himself superior to people who are not rich, white, and British. And you can certainly find some passages in his writing that would not pass muster. The Descent of Man talks an awful lot about savages, by which he means people like the Fuegians, or the tribes of Africa, or Native Americans. Here he's discussing why they have no morals. The confinement of sympathy to the same tribe, insufficient powers of reasoning. Comes out and says it. Savages have insufficient powers of reasoning and weak power of self-command. They're not smart and they have no discipline. You can find things like this that are pretty darn awful. And in this, I don't think he was particularly different from other well-off, white, Christian background Englishmen. He had the prejudices of his time, as we all do. Very few people ever, I think, truly rise above prejudices that they've got. It's not easy to do. So you can find passages like that, he definitely had racist elements in his thought. Mind you, so did Abraham Lincoln. You still, however, have to set that against the fact that Darwin makes a powerful argument that there's no unbridgeable differences between human races and human societies. We all have fundamentally the same kind of mind. As he wrote, American Aborigines, African people, and Europeans differ as much from each other in mind as any three races that can be named. Yet I was incessantly struck while living with the Fuegians on board the Beagle with the many little traits of character showing how similar their minds were to ours. And so it was with a full-blooded African with whom I happened once to be intimate. He means the former slave who taught him to stuff birds, John Edmonstone. That's why I brought him up, not as an example of tokenism. I hope it doesn't come across that way, and not just to show, oh, he can't be racist, he had black friends, but to make the point that this is data as well, that Darwin had actually come to befriend this person from a very different race and background, and come to realize that, our minds still work alike. As different as our cultures are, we still think fart jokes are funny. That's a human universal. In fact, if we talk, speaking of which, this low morality of savages, one of the things that Darwin learned on the Beagle from talking with the Fuegians was that they abandon their elderly to die. When they're so old that they can no longer hunt and gather, they're just abandoned. And Darwin said, you know, you treat them worse than your dogs. And one of the Fuegians said, dogs catch fish, old people know. And that fact got repeated in several of Darwin's writings. And it's one of the examples he's talking about savages having low morality. Nobody else who ever observed or studied the Yamana people ever observed them killing their elderly. And the current, you know, there's no other evidence that they did it. The current thinking now is that Darwin actually got punked. That one of the Fuegians, probably Jimmy Button, was pulling his leg, was, you know, telling him a story. Hey, let's see what this guy does with that. And again, that should make them all the more human, because that's probably the kind of thing you'd be tempted to do if you had to deal with some nice but really nosy guy who kept asking, you know, penetrating questions about your life, right? I mean, I've known Arkansans to, there's a book of Ozark stories called We Always Lie to Strangers, where, you know, some person from the outside comes and you just start telling them some outlandish things just to see what kind of weird stuff you'll believe. Right? I mean, I have known Arkansans to make all kinds of incest references, and it's not really common in the Ozarks, but people joke about it as if it was. Right? What does an Arkansas girl say after sex? Roll over, pa, you're laying on my spokes. I'm sorry, you don't have to laugh. I might have crossed a bit of a line there. But yeah, that should make the Fuegians that much more human. As far as we know, they didn't really abandon their elderly to die. What they were doing was punking the guy. And I suspect that is something that we can all kind of identify with, that most of you would do if you ever had the chance. Right. So yeah, the man was not PC. The man was not particularly woke. The man was not really a believer in absolute racial equality or anything like that. And you can find some pretty damning passages if you comb through his books enough. You have to set that against the fact that evolution by natural selection is one of the most powerful arguments ever created for human equality. We've all got the same ancestry. We've all got ancestors that had lots of hair and went ook, ook, eek, eek, and ate bananas. There's really no reason for any of us to be lording it over anybody else. And you have to remember that the competition at the time was worked out by an early American scientist named Samuel George Morton, who went around collecting skulls, you know, digging up old native burials and slave burying grounds, and anywhere he could find them. He amassed this huge collection of skulls. It's still, I think, at University of Pennsylvania, it's still around, measuring skull shape and skull size, and especially the cranial capacity, the size of the brain. And he concluded that there was so much different between human races that they were separate species and they had separate origins. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were only the ancestors of white people, and everybody else must have come from somewhere else. So on the right, upper right, you've got an African man compared with, on the left, the average white guy. That's actually not the average white guy, that's a freaking Greek statue. And you'll notice, if you look real carefully, there's a European skull and an African skull. And the African skull looks a lot more like the chimp skull. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that the European skull is turned just a little bit to face you, and that makes the face look flatter. And the African skull's been tilted backwards, which makes the jaws look bigger and the brain, or at least the forehead, look smaller and slope back more. There's very blatant bias in the way that these things are drawn. When you correct for bias like that, You can find subtle differences in skull shape between people of different races, but it is really not cut and dry. You can't just look at a skull and say, oh, that's an African, or oh, this is an Asian, or oh, this is a European. It is not that simple, and there are some statistics you can try to use, but they don't always work. And more importantly, when you correct for things like body size, there's no statistically significant difference in brain size between the human races either. The main thing that influences brain size is body size. Shaquille O'Neal probably has a bigger brain than I do. I'm not saying anything about who's smarter, but it doesn't mean he's a genius just because he's got a bigger brain. It just means he has a bigger body. Shaquille O'Neal has a bigger brain than I don't know if you even remember, there was a guy named Muggsy Bogues who was about 5'2" and played in the NBA. Very, very good at rebounding, couldn't slam dunk, but did everything else really, really well. And Shaquille is over 7 and Muggsy was 5 foot something. Shaquille's probably got a bigger brain, says nothing whatsoever about intelligence. But this was the competing idea, and it was remarkably popular in the American South, where you could argue that if these Africans are really a separate species from us, and they have a separate origin, then enslaving them is no worse than domesticating horses and cows. It formed part of the justification in the Southern press at the time for why slavery was natural and the way that things were meant to be. One of Darwin's contemporaries was a guy named Louis Agassiz. Agassiz had come from Switzerland. He became a professor at Harvard. And Switzerland is noted for its absence of Black people. Switzerland is like whiter than mayonnaise. And Agassiz had never seen one until he came to America and was served by African-American waiters in a Philadelphia hotel and freaked the hell out because he'd never seen one before. And he writes this letter that is, this is a quote from it, that's absolutely horrified about, oh my God, their hair is so curly and oh my, the letter can basically be summed up like, oh my God, Becky, they're so black. I like big butts, I cannot lie. You've heard that one, right? You get the reference? Okay, yeah, Agassiz flips out and decides that it is impossible for me to repress the feeling that they are not of the same blood as us. He's a polygenist. Cannot get over the feeling that Black people can't be the same species as white people. This is Darwin's competition. This is the background that this is all taking place under. And here's Darwin pointing out that, in fact, we are all one species. Our bodies are not that different. Our brains are not that different. Not just in intellect, but even in character traits and our ability to joke and our ability to, fool each other with outrageous stories and things like that. And we all come from a common ancestor. By the standards of the 1860s, remember, Darwin publishes his book right before the American Civil War breaks out. Right before the Confederate States issue these declarations of secession, claiming that they are only supporting the natural order. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession is, by an imperious law of nature, none but the African race can bear the heat of the tropical sun. Against that background, Darwin actually looks really, really good. And evolution by natural selection has been misused in some pretty horrible ways. But I think rightly understood, it makes a much more powerful argument for racial equality than people sometimes realize. Just to get it, you have to read more than the title page of the damn book. As he concluded Descent of Man, we must acknowledge that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, hey, I'm in the book, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Ain't nobody got any reason to be too proud. I've got 11:16. That is a pretty good place to take a break. Let's take 14 minutes and come back at 11:30 and we'll finish this.